how did an unsinkable ship, the world's greatest technological marvel at the time, break in two? If the wreck site is a crime scene, the breakup was her last breath. Mechanically, she was the state-of-the-art, fitted with 29 boilers, 159 furnaces. Each of her steam engines was the size of a 3-story house. Over 6,000 tons of coal filled her coal bunkers. From her innovative double-bottomed keel to her 16 watertight compartments, Titanic was considered unsinkable. Each compartment had doors that were designed to close automatically if the water level rose above a certain height. Titanic would be able to stay afloat if any 2 compartments or the first 4 became flooded. According to her builders, even in the worst possible accident at sea, Titanic was virtually unsinkable.
Iceberg, right ahead! Thank you.
But we know that on April 14th, 1912, Titanic sideswiped an iceberg and sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is the part of Titanic's story we all know. But what happened to Titanic after the last eyewitness saw her slip beneath the surface? Titanic is the perfect unsolved murder mystery. It hit there, but then it kind of whiplashes when it hits the ground back here. What happened in the final minutes of the ship? How did it break up? How did it fall? How did it hit the bottom? Why did she sink so fast? Could more lives have been saved? But what about the flooding itself and how the rushing water brought the ship down? Did her stern really rise out of the water? It's a controversial shot in the movie. A gut-wrenching, big-screen moment based on survivor testimony. But is this really how it happened? Some saw her break in 2. Others swore she went down whole. Some of the damage is easy to understand. Other aspects are downright mysterious. Like the stern, it's completely bizarre at first sight.
Just like a bomb went off overhead, you know?
It's important to know that things that people have identified as possibly iceberg damage probably aren't. A good example of this is the so-called big opening, a hole blasted in the starboard side of Titanic's bow. We now know it isn't iceberg damage, but how do we explain it and the other destruction to the bow? I think this is pretty amazing. I mean, this is completely new to me, that in the 2.5 hours it took Titanic to sink, she never capsized. We never really thought about that. It was staring us in the face. Ships capsize. We saw it recently with the Costa Concordia that sank off the coast of Italy. And when you look back at the history of all the other famous shipwrecks, they all roll over. Bismarck rolled over, Andrea Doria rolled over. But Titanic just went almost straight down. Yeah, toward the end it had maybe a variously reported 6, maybe 8-degree list. That's not much. So that creates a whole new question. Were they trimming the ship? Were the engineers, none of whom survived, were they actually trimming the ship actively? Were they fighting that? Were they that good with their pumps by filling the trim tanks and seeing the ship was listing one direction, controlling it and trying to keep it upright so they could get those boats off? Or did they just get lucky? There's a game I like to play. What would you have done if you were captain of Titanic? Could more lives have been saved? I think you could save everybody. I think you could save everybody and their dog. If the breakup was Titanic's last breath, the iceberg strike was her death blow. 100 years later, this is what's left of Titanic, a tangled wreck on the ocean floor. Thousands of broken pieces. But from her rust-covered remains, we may still be able to figure out what happened in her last moments. Well, it's very important to find out where all the objects wound up. And then you can work backwards from that to sort of reconstruct how the processes got started. You got to peel away the bottom impact. And you got to understand what happened in the water column. You got to understand what happened at the surface. Then maybe you can work your way back to what actually set off the sinking in the first place. It's like a murder mystery case where some piece of evidence is an outlier. Everything fits perfectly, but there's one outlying piece of evidence and it seems so trivial, and yet it unwinds everything else. It's a great forensic process to go through. It's the same thing that they do in an NTSB analysis of a crash site for an airliner. Now, how did that engine get way over there? How did that wind up 2 miles back? You know, you can't really piece together what happened until you can account for every single piece and where it got there. 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland and 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic lies Titanic. The wreck site spans a mile of the seafloor and is anything but accessible. It takes about 2.5 hours to descend in a submersible. Daylight doesn't reach this depth. It's eternal darkness. Here we find the bow and stern sections 2,000 feet apart. We find the ship's boilers clustered east of the stern, cargo cranes sheared from the deck, broken pieces of funnel, ground up shell plating, sections of the ship's keel or double bottom, rudders and propellers pinned in the sediment intact, an open shell door at D-deck. There are serving plates, teacups, shoes, countless personal artifacts. These are all clues in the mystery. What caused this magnitude of destruction? How can we begin to make sense of it? Titanic's bow and stern are torn in two and lie apart, like a crime scene where the body and head are on opposite sides of the room. We know from a past expedition that these two, out of the three, are pieces of Titanic's double bottom. We know these parts are from the same section of keel because their ragged ends align like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. How did these two chunks of keel detach from the bottom of the ship and end up to the east of the hypocenter? And what about the third outlier? Bow points north and is partly dug into the sediment. Its open end is ragged, it's not a clean break. At first glance, it appears the farthest object north, but there's the #1 cargo hatch, and that's 260 feet forward of the bow. And the hatch bolts are all severed. So what did that? And how did the bow break from the stern? What did this? The stern points south, facing the opposite direction of the bow. It looks like a bomb hit it. To the east of the stern lie 5 boilers from Boiler Room 1, a midsection of the ship. For the first time ever, I've gathered all the evidence and 8 of the world's leading Titanic experts, all together in one place. Some have been to the wreck, some approach it through the testimony, some approach it through the physical forensics.
We respectfully disagree.
No one gets out of this room until we piece together, once and for all, what happened in Titanic's final minutes. We're gonna argue, I guarantee you, it'll get heated.
Coincidence, there is no coincidence.
There's no such thing as coincidence, I agree. Now, on the 100th anniversary of the tragedy, 15 years after the film's initial release, it's time for the final word on what really happened to Titanic.
So here we go. It's recalculating everything on 10-second intervals. So you can see there's a long period in here between, say, 25 minutes and 45 minutes or so before you get much flooding in other places.
Can you stop for 1 second? How's it getting to here?
Where-
Is that
where's
is
that,
that Scotland Road?
This is